Does anybody want the Lord to speak to their hearts? Say, speak, Lord. We're waiting to hear from you. Desperately waiting, yes. And now listen as, oh Lord, speak, Lord, speak. That's our prayer today for you to speak, Jesus. Speak to us, Lord. Speak to our hearts, speak to our minds, and we'll listen as you speak to us. Speak, Lord, speak. Come on, Jesus. All we want to do is hear from you. And now listen as you speak to me. 'Cause your word is life, joy, and peace. It brings revelation as far as the eye can see. Your word is the very air I breathe. So listen as I pray. And I'll listen as you speak. Does anybody else besides me need a word from the Lord? I said, does anybody else besides me need a word from the Lord? We're standing all over the sanctuary. Bless the name of our God for our music ministry, ministering to us in this way. Are we ready? Y'all don't sound like y'all ready today. Are we ready? Aim, fire. This is my Bible. There are many like it, but this one is mine. It is my weapon. It is my roadmap in enemy country. In my Bible is found the plan of salvation. Romans 10:9 says that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. It is by our humility towards our Christ, hospitality within our congregation, hard work within our community, that the unsaved will be won to Christ. Amen. This message today is for somebody that the Lord has told you to remain standing. The Lord has told you to do something, and someone has talked you out of it. This message for someone. Perhaps the Lord has called you to go back to school or to even change jobs. This message for somebody that's God is challenging to come out of your comfort zone. I would that you would turn with me to the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter. Matthew chapter 14. And when you get there, say amen. If you're not there, say I'll be in Bible study on Tuesday. I can't hear nobody. Matthew chapter 14, and for your hearing, I want to look at verses 22 through 33. And I don't want to do all the work this morning. I want to read verse 22. You'll read verse 23, and we'll interchange, and we'll conclude on verse number 33. Reading from the King James Version, Matthew 14, verse number 22 says, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit. And they cried out for fear. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And when they were coming to the ship, the wind ceased. Let's read together. Then they that were in the ship came and worshiped him, saying, of a truth, thou art the Son. Amen. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand. If you don't mind, grab a neighbor by the hand, look them in the eye like you love the Lord. Some of y'all don't look like y'all love anybody this morning. Smile at them, show them all of your pearly whites, and say, you look absolutely marvelous. Today's sermon subject, giant steps. You may be seated. Henry David Thoreau said that if you are not keeping pace with others, that perhaps you're marching to the beat of a distant drummer. He says, keep on marching, no matter how measured that beat might be. In other words, to calibrate your compass towards heaven, to make sure that your heart, your mind, and soul is on the frequency of heaven. It was John Coltrane that at the age of 35 decided to take a giant step and to step outside of his comfort zone. He decided to create an album using all original tunes, which was unheard of that time in the jazz industry. For jazz artists usually colored each other's tunes. But Coltrane decided to take a giant step, knowing that at the age of 35, this could certainly mean the end of his jazz career. And people warned him. They criticized his ambition and his goal, but Coltrane took that giant step. And in February of 1960, he released that album called Giant Steps. And it was so successful that he actually set the tune and the tenor for other jazz musicians. And they begin to emulate. They begin to do the same thing that Coltrane did, simply because he had enough faith to take a giant step. My brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, I stopped by to tell you that there are often times in life that God requires us to take a giant step without much time to think about it. I wish I had some help in it this morning. Peter took, come on and help me preach. Chapter 14, Jesus has just fed a crowd of 5,000 people, not including the women and the children. There was a crowd of upward 18,000 people that he fed with 2 little fish and 5 loaves of bread. If you read this text all the way down, you discover that there were 12 baskets of fish that were left over, fragments of which Lloyd Ogilvie calls Jesus the Lord of the leftovers, that he's able to take our scraps and turn them into a surplus. In other words, little becomes much. I wish y'all felt like it. In the master's hand. As a matter of fact, you can help me preach this. Look at your neighbor, be careful. They might be looking back at you, and tell them little becomes much in the master's hand. Can I stop right here and pause parenthetically and just ask the question, is there anybody here that's ever started out with little, but you placed it in the master's hand and he's able to multiply, turn your scraps into a surplus? He takes that little and he makes much. And imagination suggests that when the crowd is fed, he gives the benediction on the masses and he constrains the disciples to get in a ship and go over to the other side. John 6:15 says that he does it because this crowd wants to force Jesus into being the king And I want to stop right here and pause parenthetically once again and say you got to be careful of people that want to make you king for a day. Because the same people that will make you king, come on and help me out here, on a Sunday will crucify you on a Friday. Jesus sends the disciples away because he does not want them to get involved in this mess. And when he goes away, Matthew says that Jesus goes up into the mountains alone to pray. Another interesting thing about Matthew is now he shifts the sermonic spotlight to the disciples that are in that little ship that Jesus told them to get into. And Matthew says they're in the midst of the sea, in the middle of the perfect storm. Their little ship is being tossed to and fro like a rubber ball. And Matthew says at the fourth watch of the night, Jesus comes walking on the water. And out of fear, they perceive that Jesus is a ghost. But watch this. Jesus speaks first. And he says, be of good cheer. It is I. Be of good cheer. It is I. Be of good cheer. It is I. We're going to put a pin right there. We'll come back later and pull that out. He says, be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. Peter, who's always ahead of the class. Peter, who's always speaking out of turn. Peter, who's always putting his foot in his mouth. He says, Lord, if it's really you, bid me to come to you. Jesus said, come on. And Matthew says that Peter steps out of the boat. And Peter is doing the miraculous. Can I stop right here and say sometimes in order to do the miraculous, you've got to believe the ridiculous. And Peter believes when Jesus says, come to me, that if Jesus said, come, then I'm going to walk on that water. And he steps out of the boat and he begins to walk on water. He's walking towards Jesus. Matthew says that the winds and the waves are boisterous, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus. And he starts to look at the winds and the waves. And it was then when he took his eyes off of Jesus, Lord, God help me, that text says that he began to sink. And he cries, Lord, save me. And Jesus says, why are you afraid? He picks him up, places him in the ship. Text says that at that time, immediately the wind stopped. And they said, surely thou art Son of God. That's the story. Here's the lesson. Because the text is tailored to teach somebody in here this morning that sometimes obeying Jesus will get you in trouble. Walk with me. Because in verse number 22, it says Jesus constrained the disciples to get in that ship. They didn't come up with that idea. They didn't say, let us get in the ship. But Jesus constrains them. In other words, Jesus forces them to get into the ship. Y'all not feeling me? To get into the other side. In other words, Jesus sends them in to that storm. Mark chapter 6, verse 48 says that when Jesus goes to the mountain, he's watching them. In other words, Jesus put them in the middle of a storm. Maybe I can stop right here and say there are different types of storm. Some storms are for our correction. Preach your T, Moses. And some storms are for our correction. Jonah was put in a storm for his correction. God told Jonah to do one thing. Jonah did another thing. God sent the storm in Jonah's life for his correction. But these disciples were not sent in a storm for their correction. They were sent in a storm for their perfection. I wish I had a witness in here. See, God puts them in a storm to see how they're going to handle it. Y'all missing it. He constrains them to get in a storm, and they obey what he said. And Mark 6:48 says, while they're struggling in the middle of the storm, Jesus is on that mountain. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sometimes God puts us in the storm, watch this, to see how we're going to handle it. Sometimes God sends storms our way because we are the ones that said, I'm saved and sanctified. Come on and help me out here. We are the ones that said, I believe that he's able to do it. We are the one that said God is greater than. We are the one that says he has all power in his hands. And he says, if you really believe it, then act like it. Obeying Jesus can get you in trouble. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yes. Not only will obeying Jesus get you in trouble, but some storms you just got to endure. Watch the movements in the text. Matthew says it's the fourth watch of the night. Jewish time is categorized into 4 watch, 6 to 9, first watch, 9 to 12, second watch, 12 to 3, third watch, 3 to 6 is the fourth watch. It literally means that they have been in this storm for almost 12 hours. This trip across the shore was only 3 miles, 12 miles, only should have took 3 hours to get across. But Jesus lets them struggle, for the text says that when Jesus comes walking, they're in the middle of the sea. In other words, they're just as far from their departure as they are to their destination. They've invested so much in the trip so far that it wouldn't make no sense to turn around. I'm looking at somebody in here that's saying, Reverend, I know what you're talking about, because the storm that I'm in right now, I've invested so much in it. I'm just as close as my destination as I am from my imposture. Some storms you cannot escape. Some storms you just got to endure. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You've just got to go through it. There are no escape hatches. Life plays in exact ways. You get out of it what you put into it. There are no secret slots to get out of some storms. Some storms you've just got to go through. Come on and help me preach this. Give your neighbor a high five. Tell him you can make it through your storm. Obeying Jesus can put you in a storm. Some storms you just got to endure. But here it is. Storms have a way of minimizing your memory. Jesus comes walking on the water, and they couldn't recognize who he was. And I want to suggest that sometimes storms have a way of shaking our faith. Storms have a way of putting us in a corner where we expect him to come one way and he comes a totally different way. Sometimes we expect him to come in a very traditional way, and sometimes he comes out of the box. Is there anybody here that knows that you cannot relegate Jesus to some historical legend in time? He's bigger than the pages of Genesis and Revelation. He shows up in the midst of our storm. I need about 10 folk that are not ashamed to just stand on your feet and say, he'll show up. And listen, when he shows up, tell somebody, not only will he show up, he'll show out. Is there anybody in here that can testify that when he shows up, he can turn your situation? Sit down. Minimize your memory. This text is tailored to teach us that storms pull us out of our comfort zone. Sometimes God has to put us in some storms for us to come out of familiar territory. And sometimes in order to get what we've never had, we've got to leave what we've always known. And sometimes what we walk away from will determine what God will bring your way. Yeah, I see you nodding your head. Amen goes good right through there. If you know what I'm talking about, say amen. Sometimes you got to walk away from some stuff in order for God to take you where you need to be. Sometimes you got to leave some people behind in order to get what God has had for you. There were 12 of them in that boat. But Peter was the only one that said, Lord, bid me to come. It's all right to say I'm different. It's okay that everybody don't think like you do. It's all right when folks tell you not to do something and God tells you to do it. Sometimes you got to step out there all by yourself. I'm preaching this because in this life, there will be people that criticize what God has called you to do. And those same people will criticize you, what you're doing, to take the attention off of what they're not doing. Is this making sense to anybody in here? Time is of the essence. Sometimes God calls us to make sudden moves or giant steps without a lot of time to think about it. But you got to be sure that you recognize him when you see him. I'm talking to somebody in here that's broke and don't want to be fixed. I'm talking to somebody in here that needs to hear the voice of God calling you out of your comfort zone. I'm talking to somebody that's in the boat of complacency right now, the boat of fear. What is your boat? You got a boat. Everybody's got some type of boat. And the bad thing about the boat is that God is calling you to come out of your comfort zone, but you manufactured your own misery in your own boat. As a matter of fact, you create your own pity party. Don't send out no invitations and get mad when don't nobody show up because we have a hard time getting out of our boat. Two construction workers were eating lunch, and the one pulls out his lunch and he says, "Bologna again." It's the third time this week I've had bologna. The other one said, "Man, why don't you tell your wife to make you something different?" He said, "I don't have no wife. I made these sandwiches myself." All I'm saying is some of the bologna in your life, you made it yourself. You got to get out of your comfort zone. Here's the question. Let me get out of here. How do you take a giant step? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. I'm going to give them to you. Sit down and shout my own self happy. The text suggests that if God is calling you to take a giant step, the first thing you got to do is you got to recognize who Jesus is. He comes in the storm, and they don't recognize who he is. Let's pull that pen out. But he says, "Be of good cheer. It is I." Be of good cheer might not have been so much comfort to them on that storm. But when he said, "It is I," their antennas should have went up. Because John records that during this time, it was the time of the Passover. And that Old Testament scripture would have been read over and over and over again. And that Isaiah 43 would have not been a stranger to these 12 men in the boat. And they know the equivalent of "it is I" is "I am he." And Isaiah puts it clear that we serve the I am God, the God that's in control of the water, the God that's in control of the waves. And so when they heard "it is I," it is equivalent to "I am he." Or as Isaiah would say it, that where I am, God is. God help me. In other words, they recognized the divinity of Jesus when they were in that boat. All I'm saying is that when you're going through the storms of life, you need to recognize God when he shows up. And sometimes you won't recognize him if you don't know his word. Preach your T, Moses. I'm doing the best I can, Lord. Is there anybody here that can thank God that when he shows up with his word, you can be of good cheer because you recognize the I amness of God. I am water when you're thirsty. I am bread when you're hungry. I'm a friend for the friendless. Is there anybody here that recognizes that he's everything that you need? They recognized him. That's the first thing they did. They recognized him when he showed up, but then they relied on his word. He said, it is I. It is I. I am that I am. Before there was a wind, or where I am. I am before there is, before there was. I am. I am God. They had just been in a storm previous of this storm. And the difference between that storm and this storm is that the storm before, Jesus was on the boat. This storm, he allows them to go into the test. And sometimes Jesus removes himself from your storm to see how you're going to handle that test. In that first storm, Jesus said 3 words. Peace, be still. And I like the language of antiquity. That old preacher, my grandfather, would say that the lightning tucked its tail like a coward dog. That the wind went back to the 4 corners of the earth. And those waves laid down like a sheet on the Sealy Posturepedic mattress. Y'all ain't hearing what I'm saying to you. When he says peace, he's able to give peace. When he says peace, storms calm down. Is there anybody that's ever been in a storm and he said peace, peace? You got to make sure you recognize, I'm almost done. You got to rely on his word, and then you got to remove yourself out of familiar territory. That's what Peter does. He comes out of the boat, and maybe I ought to stop right there and say, like John Ortberg said, if you want to walk on water, you got to get out the boat. You can't walk on the water sitting in the boat. Can I give you the 79th Street Chicago vernacular? Bust a move. Don't be sitting around just waiting for time to keep going. I got some Chicago folk in here. Bust a move. When Jesus says, come. Now let me stop right here. Because I hear somebody saying, all right, I hear you. Pastor Moses told me. Pastor Moses ain't told you nothing. What I'm suggesting to you is that Peter in this instance did not exercise foolish faith. Foolish faith says I could jump out the window, 10th floor, land on my foot. What Peter does different in this, and I have to applaud Peter, is that before he gets out the boat, he waits for Jesus to say, come. And that's a word to somebody in here this morning. You're waiting on the Lord, and you know you need to make a move, but God hasn't told you to come. You can't go out on your own free will and accord. You got to wait until he says come. See, y'all ain't saying amen, because some of y'all done stepped out without him saying come on. And that's why we're in the pickle that we're in right now. But if you can learn how to wait on the response of Christ. I'm working harder than they saying amen. Ooh-wee. Y'all done got me tired of it. Wait, thank you, Pastor, man. I feel all right now. I got some help from my hero back there. I'm all right now. Here it is. You got to remove yourself from your comfort zone. That's number 3. Number 4, you got to remain focused. It's an easy, simple Sunday school lesson, fixed facsimile. Peter gets out the boat. He's walking towards Christ. The waves start to rise. And when he takes his eyes off of Jesus, looks at the waves, he starts to sink. And I want to suggest that Satan is a master distraction. He will distract you from coming to church. He will from coming to Bible study. He will distract you from praying. He will distract you from praising God. He will do anything. See, some of y'all distracted right now. Whatever I'm saying don't have nothing to do with you texting right now. Come on, say amen if you can right now. God wants us to be focused. He wants us when we step out of our comfort zone. Make sure your eyes are standing straight on Jesus. You got to remain focused. Here's the last thing. I'm done. You got to risk it all on Jesus. I quit. Risk it all on Jesus. What do you mean? Was Peter a failure? Because after all, he did sink. But I want to suggest that Peter had enough faith to do what the other 11 didn't. I want to suggest that the failures in this text are the 11 disciples that did not get out of the boat. I want to suggest that you got to risk it all on Jesus because he risked it all on you. The original giant step was over 2,000 years ago on a hill called Calvary. When he stepped up on Golgotha's skull, the heel of the skull, and gave his hands to the spike, his knees to the nails, his head to the crown, his side to the spit. He took a giant step because he risked it all on us. Died a vicarious death. That means he died in your place. And he died in our place. And I'm looking for somebody in here that can thank God that we serve a God that was willing to risk it all on us. As a matter of fact, you can help me preach this because he saw the best in me when everyone else around could only see the worst in me. I'm looking for somebody in Calvary that's going to help me close this morning. As a matter of fact, look at your neighbor and say, don't be afraid. Neither be dismayed. Whatever betide, because God will take good care of you. Is there anybody in here that knows the Lord will take good care of you? Then do me this favor this morning, and I'll get in my seat. Just grab that neighbor by the hand and look them in the eye and say, neighbor, oh neighbor, say neighbor, I know a man that's from Galilee. When I was in trouble, he set me free. Son of David, seed of Abraham, stone you out of the mountain, meek and humble lamb. Good morning now, Calvary. God bless you real good. But is there anybody in here that don't mind celebrating with me? Then do me this favor and I'll leave you alone. If you're not too mean, if you're not too cool, to stand on your feet this morning and throw up both your hands and say, Father, Father, you've been good to me, and wherever you lead me, I will follow. Some through the darkness, some through some pain, but he promised never to leave me alone. Ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? Say yeah, yeah, yes, sir. I'm done. We're standing all over the sanctuary. I don't know who that message was for this morning. It's for somebody that needs to step out of your comfort zone. Because we serve a God. I said we serve a God that's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we could ask us. I don't know who I'm talking to today. Might be someone in the church. Don't want to take for granted. Everyone here is a member of the church. And So we want to extend this invitation with you in mind at this time. Reverend Roger Glenn to come to extend the privilege of the church. Let's say amen for him as he comes. The doors of the church are now standing open. If you want to come, there's a candidate for baptism. Christian
Know what they say.
What about that? We just ask
No
you,
one's perfect.
please take that giant step.
Neither am I.
To know
I guess that's
Lord
why nothing's
Jesus
worth.
Christ, that's your Savior.
They say God is
Please
good,
recognize that it's never too late
but how can that be?
to come to know
I
Christ.
feel I'm the proof. And if you want to see, just look at me.